Jake Turner had been riding since sunrise, and the long trail across the open land felt heavier than usual that day. The sky was gray, the wind was sharp, and dark clouds gathered over the distant hills like a warning. Jake had traveled these plains for years, but he had never liked the way storms appeared suddenly in that valley. They rolled in fast, with cold rain that cut through every layer of clothing and wind that could push a rider off balance even on a calm horse. Still, Jake kept riding because he believed he had no choice. He never stayed anywhere long, and he never asked anyone for help. He had lived that way so long that it felt normal to him. His horse, Scout, sensed the coming storm before he did. The animal shook its head and slowed down, hooves sinking into the softening earth. Jake knew he should stop. Maybe find shelter, but stubbornness pushed him forward. He kept thinking he could outrun the rain, that he only needed another hour to clear the valley. He was wrong. The storm landed on him in seconds. A loud crack tore across the sky, the wind blew sideways, and Scout panicked. The horse slipped on wet ground, and Jake felt his body throw forward. He grabbed the saddle horn, but his hand slipped. The next moment, he hit the ground hard on his side. His ribs exploded with pain, and the air shot out of his lungs. For a few seconds, he couldn't move or breathe. Scout circled nearby, frightened but loyal, waiting for him to stand up. Jake tried to push himself up, but pain shot through his chest so sharply that he had to stop and hold still. The rain soaked his clothes, and the cold made the pain even worse. He knew he couldn't stay there. The storm would only get stronger, and he was too far from town to make it safely. He needed shelter fast. With a shaky breath, he reached for Scout's reins and pulled himself up. The horse lowered its head, almost as if it understood he needed help. Jake climbed into the saddle slowly, gritting his teeth as pain spread across his ribs. He remembered hearing about an old cabin somewhere in the valley. Someone lived there, but he didn't know who. A few travelers had mentioned a quiet woman who kept to herself. Jake didn't care about the details. Any roof would be better than riding blind through the storm. It took him nearly half an hour to reach the small wooden cabin. By then, he was dizzy from pain and rain. The cabin sat near a stone ridge, protected from the worst of the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside. Jake slid off Scout and walked toward the door, holding his ribs. Before he could knock, the door opened, and a young woman appeared with a lantern in her hand. She was surprised to see anyone, especially a soaked cowboy struggling to stand. Her name was Ella Dawson, though Jake didn't know that yet. Ella had lived alone for years. She wasn't afraid of strangers, but she also wasn't used to them. Still, the moment she saw the way Jake held his side, she knew he was hurt. She asked if he was all right, but Jake shook his head and said he didn't want to trouble her. His voice was rough, and he tried to stand tall even as he nearly collapsed. Ella stepped forward quickly and took his arm, guiding him inside before he could protest. The warmth of the cabin hit him immediately, the smell of firewood, baked bread, and herbs. Jake didn't think he deserved such comfort. He wasn't used to kindness. Inside, Ella helped him sit on a small bench near the fireplace. She didn't ask many questions at first. She simply looked at his soaked clothes and said he needed to get warm before he froze. She handed him a blanket, then knelt down to check his ribs from a safe and careful distance. Jake flinched when she pressed lightly on the injury, and Ella knew instantly that something was wrong. She told him he shouldn't move. Jake tried to argue, saying he would leave once the rain slowed, but Ella didn't listen. She wasn't rude. She was firm. She told him the storm would last through the night and that he wasn't in a condition to ride anywhere. Jake reluctantly agreed because he had no strength left to argue. Ella brought out clean cloth, warm water, and a small jar of herbal salve that belonged to her mother. She explained each step clearly and calmly, making sure he understood she was only trying to help. Jake watched her work with quiet respect. Her hands were gentle, her voice soft, and her movements careful. It had been years since anyone treated him like a person who mattered. When she asked him how he got hurt, Jake lied at first. He said he just slipped. But Ella looked at him in a way that made him feel she already knew the truth. Eventually, he admitted that he fell from his horse during the storm. Ella shook her head and said he was lucky he didn't break more than ribs. She told him that riding in such weather was foolish. Her honesty surprised Jake. Most people didn't speak so directly to him. After tending to his injury, Ella stood and looked around her small one-room cabin. The only bed was against the far wall. The bench Jake sat on was narrow and cold, not suitable for someone in pain. Ella hesitated for a moment, then told him he should lie on the bed. It was the warmest place, and it would keep his ribs still. Jake refused immediately. He said he couldn't take her bed, that he would sleep on the floor instead. But Ella didn't accept that. She crossed her arms and told him that if he slept on the floor in his condition, he would wake up worse or not wake up at all. Jake stared at her, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to anyone insisting on helping him. Finally, Ella guided him toward the bed, supporting his weight as he walked. He was embarrassed. But he knew he needed the support. When he lay down, the soft blanket and warm quilt felt almost unreal compared to the storm outside. Ella sat on a chair near the fire and watched him quietly, making sure he wasn't in too much pain. Jake asked her why she lived alone in such a quiet place. She didn't answer fully, only said she preferred peace. Jake understood that feeling well. After a while, Ella brought him warm tea and told him he needed to rest. Jake tried to apologize again for troubling her, but Ella stopped him gently. She said anyone would have done the same, though Jake doubted that. As the storm raged outside, Jake closed his eyes. He listened to the rain hitting the roof, the crackling fire, and Ella moving softly around the cabin. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. Not because the world had become kinder, but because someone cared enough to help him when he had nothing to offer in return. That thought stayed with him as sleep finally pulled him under. Jake woke the next morning with a dull ache in his ribs and the soft sound of rain still hitting the cabin roof. The storm had not passed during the night the way he hoped. It had only grown heavier, as if the sky wanted to keep him in that little wooden shelter longer than he planned. When he opened his eyes, he found Ella moving quietly around the room, placing more wood in the fireplace and checking a pot she had left near the warm coals. She noticed he was awake and gave him a small, polite smile. Jake tried to sit up, but pain shot through his side so suddenly that he froze halfway. Ella rushed over and told him not to move too fast. Jake didn't want to seem weak, so he insisted he was fine. But Ella didn't believe him for a second. She asked him where it hurt, and Jake shook his head, saying it didn't matter. She reminded him gently that pretending wasn't going to help him heal. Jake didn't have an answer for that. Ella brought him warm water mixed with herbs. She told him the drink would ease swelling and calm the pain. Jake accepted it because he didn't have the strength to argue. While he drank, Ella watched him with a calm but sharp expression, as if she was trying to figure him out. Jake wasn't used to attention like that. It made him uncomfortable, but it also made him feel something he had not felt in a long time: seen. The storm outside roared loudly again. Thunder shook the windows, and Jake turned his head toward the sound. He hated storms. They reminded him of moments in his life he tried to bury: the night his younger brother had gotten hurt, the night Jake felt responsible, the night that changed him forever. He closed his eyes, trying to push away those memories, but Ella noticed the change in his face. She didn't ask questions, but she placed a hand lightly on the blanket near his arm, a silent sign that she understood he was troubled. Her gentleness surprised Jake. He wasn't used to people reading him so easily. Ella's quiet nature wasn't weakness. It was a kind of strength Jake had never been around before. After a few minutes, Jake tried to swing his legs off the bed. Ella immediately stepped in front of him and asked what he thought he was doing. Jake replied that he needed to get up, get outside, saddle his horse, and continue his journey. Ella stared at him as if he had said something unbelievable. She told him plainly that he couldn't go anywhere with ribs that hurt every time he inhaled deeply. Jake insisted again, saying he didn't want to trouble her, that she had already done enough, that he didn't deserve to take up her space. Ella didn't like hearing that. She told him he wasn't trouble, and that a person helping another person wasn't something to feel guilty about. Her tone was soft but firm, and Jake realized she wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. But he still tried to stand because he couldn't help himself. He had lived so long keeping people at a distance that accepting help felt wrong. When Jake put weight on his legs, pain shook him so hard he had to grab the bedpost to stay standing. Ella moved forward quickly and held his elbow, steadying him. She told him, in a sharper voice than before, that if he kept acting stubborn, he would injure himself worse. Jake sighed and sat down again because the pain wouldn't let him pretend otherwise. Ella took a deep breath and began tending to his ribs again, checking the bandage she had placed the night before. Jake watched her work with a kind of quiet respect. She wasn't just helping him because it was polite. She truly cared that he healed. Jake had not felt such concern from anyone in years. It made the room feel warmer, even if he didn't want to admit it. As Ella worked, she asked a few questions about where he was headed. Jake hesitated before answering. He said he wasn't going anywhere important, just moving from place to place. Ella asked if he had family waiting for him. Jake said no. She didn't press further, sensing that the subject was painful. Instead, she told him that sometimes wandering was a way to avoid something, not a way to find something. Jake didn't respond, but the words sat heavily in his mind. For the rest of the morning, Ella kept him resting. She prepared food, simple broth and bread, and brought it to him on the bed. Jake felt strange eating while lying down, but Ella didn't want him sitting unless necessary. When he tried to help by reaching for something or adjusting his blanket, she would shake her head and remind him that healing required patience. Later, while the rain softened for a short moment, Jake tried again to stand without telling her. He pushed himself up slowly, thinking Ella wouldn't notice, but she turned around just in time to see him lifting himself off the mattress. She rushed over and gently pushed him back down. Her eyes showed frustration and worry at the same time. She told him that if he kept forcing his body to do what it wasn't ready for, he would cause long-term damage. Jake finally asked her why she cared so much. He didn't mean it in a rude way. He genuinely couldn't understand. Ella looked surprised by the question. She sat on the chair beside the bed and folded her hands. She said that no one should ride out injured into a storm. She said that she had seen people try to act strong and end up hurting themselves badly. She didn't want to watch that happen to someone standing right in front of her. There was something deeper behind her words, something she wasn't saying. Jake sensed it. He didn't ask, though. He respected her silence the way she respected his. As the afternoon grew darker, Ella lit a lantern and checked the fire again. She kept the place warm, knowing warmth helped Jake's ribs relax. Jake watched her move around the cabin. She was gentle but efficient, quiet but steady, alone but not lonely. Jake wondered how someone like her ended up living so far from town. Ella eventually explained without him asking. She said the cabin belonged to her parents, who had passed away years ago. She stayed because the place felt like home and because she didn't want to live surrounded by noise and crowds. Jake understood that immediately. He knew what it meant to choose silence after a life of too much noise. By evening, the storm grew strong again. Lightning lit the windows and Scout, Jake's horse, made nervous sounds outside the stable. Jake tried to sit up again to check on him, but Ella stopped him and said she already fed the horse and made sure he was dry. Jake felt a spark of gratitude he couldn't hide. He thanked her softly. Ella told him he didn't need to thank her for basic kindness. Jake wasn't used to hearing that. When the wind finally calmed, Jake rested back on the pillow. Ella covered him with another blanket and told him to breathe slowly so the pain didn't return sharply. Jake looked at her and said she didn't have to take care of him this way. Ella shook her head and said she knew he wasn't healed yet. That was reason enough. As night fell, Jake felt a quiet peace he hadn't felt in a long time. His ribs hurt, but his mind felt lighter. He didn't know why Ella's presence eased something in him, but it did. Maybe it was because she didn't treat him like a burden. Maybe it was because she didn't ask too many questions. Maybe it was because she saw right through his stubbornness, but never judged him for it. Jake drifted into sleep, listening to the fire crackle and the gentle movements of Ella closing the shutters. The storm outside was strong, but inside, the warmth made everything feel safe. Jake didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in years, he wasn't eager to run from a place. He felt quietly that staying wasn't the worst thing he could do. Jake woke before dawn, long before the first hint of morning light touched the hills. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving the room dim and warm but still quieter than the storm outside. The pain in his ribs had eased just enough for him to think he could stand. That thought was dangerous. But Jake was used to ignoring danger when it came to himself. He believed he had already taken more help than he deserved, and he didn't want Ella losing sleep or comfort because of him. He pushed himself up slowly, careful not to make noise. Every breath pulled at his ribs, but he refused to let pain keep him down. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and gripped the wooden frame with both hands. The room swayed for a second, and he had to close his eyes to steady himself. When he opened them again, he took a slow breath, held his side, and prepared to stand. He didn't get far. The moment he tried to lift himself, pain shot through his chest so sharply that he nearly fell back onto the mattress. The sound he made, small but not small enough, echoed through the quiet cabin. He froze. Maybe Ella didn't hear. Maybe she was still asleep. He took one more breath and tried again, even though every part of him told him to stop. This time, he got halfway to standing before another bolt of pain pushed him downward. He grabbed the side of the bed desperately to keep from falling. That was when he heard footsteps. Ella appeared in the doorway, her hair braided loosely, lantern light behind her making her silhouette soft and steady. She was half asleep, but her eyes widened when she saw Jake struggling to stand. She hurried toward him faster than he expected. Jake tried to lie back down quickly so she wouldn't worry, but the movement itself made him hiss in pain. Ella reached him at the same moment, placing both hands gently but firmly on his shoulders to stop him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "Why would you try to get up like this?" Jake didn't look at her at first. He stared at the floor, ashamed. He muttered that he didn't want to trouble her anymore. He said he planned to check his horse and ride out quietly before she woke. Ella's expression changed instantly. She wasn't angry, but she was clearly frustrated and frightened by his stubbornness. She said his ribs were far from healed and that leaving now could cause serious harm. Jake tried to argue, but before he could say much, the cabin spun again, and he had to grip the blanket to keep balanced. Ella knelt beside him and inspected his bandages. She told him his ribs were still swollen and that he probably strained them again by forcing himself out of bed. Jake didn't argue. He knew she was right, but old habits made him feel guilty for needing help. Ella stood and put her hands on her hips, trying to stay calm. Jake tried to rise again, thinking maybe he could push through the pain just long enough to saddle Scout, but Ella stepped directly in front of him. "No," she said firmly, "not like this." Jake said he was fine. Ella shook her head. She told him he was not fine, not even close. She said he was doing to himself exactly what people with too much pride do, pushing until they break. Jake opened his mouth to argue again, but Ella moved faster than he imagined. She sat on the bed and gently but firmly positioned herself across his legs, not in a romantic way, but in a clear, protective way that made it impossible for him to stand. She wasn't hurting him. She was stopping him from hurting himself. Jake stared at her in surprise, unsure what to do. Ella said softly but firmly, "You're not healed. If I let you stand, you'll collapse outside. You'll fall again, and there won't be anyone nearby to help you." Jake blinked slowly. He wasn't used to someone speaking with that kind of fear in their voice. Fear for him. The feeling unsettled him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He looked at Ella and saw something new in her expression. She wasn't just frustrated. She was scared. She genuinely cared if he got hurt. Ella, still sitting across his legs to keep him from rising, began to breathe heavily, like she was trying not to cry or get angry. She told him she had seen people ignore injuries before. She told him she'd watched someone dear to her try to act strong until the damage became permanent. Jake realized then that her reaction wasn't just about him leaving. It was about something from her past. He softened his voice and asked her why she cared so much. Ella didn't answer at first. She looked down at her hands, then at the window where the storm clouds still gathered. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "I don't want to lose anyone else," she said simply. Jake felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with pain. He didn't know the details of her past, but he could feel the weight behind her words. He understood loss deeply himself. Maybe that was why her words hit him so hard. He told her softly that he didn't want to cause her worry. Ella shook her head and said worry was better than regret. She said if he left now, she would never forgive herself if something happened to him on the road. Jake didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Ella moved off his legs only after she was sure he wasn't going to try standing again. She guided him gently back into the bed and pulled the blanket higher across his chest. She asked him to breathe slowly so the pain didn't spike again. Jake did as she said, partly because he didn't want to cause her more distress, and partly because he finally accepted that she was right. Ella checked his ribs again, her hands steady even though her voice still shook a little. She told him he needed days of rest, not minutes. She brought warm tea and made him drink it slowly. Jake felt embarrassed, but also strangely comforted. Time passed quietly as the storm outside grew weaker. Ella stayed near, watching him carefully, as if making sure he wouldn't try to escape again. Jake had to admit that he felt safer lying there than he had felt in years. Eventually, Jake apologized, not for staying, but for trying to leave in such a condition. Ella accepted the apology with a small nod. She said stubbornness wasn't a crime, but putting himself in danger was unnecessary. Jake told her softly that he didn't know how to accept care without feeling guilty. Ella said healing wasn't weakness. She said even strong people needed rest. Jake looked at her and realized that Ella wasn't just trying to keep him alive. She was trying to give him something he had long forgotten existed: kindness without conditions. As the morning light finally broke through the clouds, Jake lay back in the bed, feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also a sense of peace. Ella sat on the chair near him, hands folded in her lap, ready to keep watch. Jake whispered that he wouldn't try to leave again. Ella let out a breath she had been holding and gave him a soft, grateful smile. Then she said quietly, "Good, because you're not healed yet, and I'm not letting anything happen to you." Jake closed his eyes, letting her words settle deep in his heart, feeling, for the first time in a long time, that maybe staying wasn't a sign of weakness at all. The rest of the morning passed slowly, but it carried a different feeling than before. Jake lay against the pillows, still tired but calmer now that Ella had stopped him from doing something foolish. The storm outside had weakened into light rain, and small streaks of sunlight tried to push through the heavy clouds. The cabin felt warm and bright in a gentle, comforting way. It reminded Jake of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, even if temporary. Ella moved around the cabin quietly, preparing fresh herbs, warming water, and checking on his bandages from time to time. She didn't talk much at first. She seemed to be thinking about something, maybe trying to understand why she reacted so strongly when he tried to leave earlier. Jake noticed the way her hands hesitated now and then, like her thoughts were drifting far away. He wondered what memories were troubling her, but he didn't ask. He didn't want to open any old wounds. Jake rested with his eyes half closed, watching her from time to time. Ella didn't realize he was observing her movements closely. She had a peaceful way of walking, a calmness in her breathing, and a gentleness in every small action. It was the kind of peace Jake had been searching for without knowing it. The kind of peace that couldn't be found on dusty roads or crowded saloons or noisy towns. It was something rare, something that came only when a person cared deeply without asking for anything in return. Finally, Ella broke the quiet. She sat beside him, placing a bowl of warm broth on a small table. She didn't hand it to him immediately, knowing he still needed her help to sit comfortably. Jake tried to sit up on his own, but a sharp pain stopped him halfway. Ella reached out quickly to support his back, helping him lean forward without further strain. Jake felt embarrassed again, but Ella didn't let him feel ashamed for long. She held the bowl steady as he took slow, careful sips. When he finished, she set the bowl aside and adjusted the pillows behind him. Jake watched her quietly as she worked. Unable to understand why someone who barely knew him cared enough to treat him like family. He finally asked in a soft voice if she had always lived alone. Ella didn't answer right away. She sat down on the chair near him, clasping her hands in her lap. Her eyes softened as she stared at the crackling fire. She told him she grew up in the cabin with her parents. They had loved the valley, the open land, the silence. They taught her how to care for animals, how to use herbs, how to make a home feel warm, even when the world outside was harsh. Then she paused, her voice lowering. She told him they passed away too early, her mother from illness, her father from an accident in the woods. She had been left alone to take care of everything. She was young, frightened, and unsure how to live without the people who had always guided her. Jake listened without interrupting. He could feel the pain in her voice, not loud but deep, like something that stayed buried for years. Ella continued, saying that after losing both parents, she tried living in town for a short time. But it didn't feel right. Noise made her anxious. Crowds made her uncomfortable. People moved on too quickly, while she still felt stuck between memories and loneliness. So she returned to the cabin. She fixed it up with her own hands, grew her own garden, and lived quietly, because quiet was the only thing that didn't hurt. Jake didn't realize he was staring at her with sympathy until she looked up and met his eyes. She gave him a small, sad smile. She told him she didn't mind solitude, but she hated the feeling of losing someone she cared about. After her parents, she made herself believe she could handle anything, except watching another person walk into danger. Jake understood everything instantly. Her reaction earlier, her fear, her insistence on stopping him. It all came from a place of old pain. She just didn't want to lose someone again, even if that person was a stranger she met only yesterday. Jake took a slow breath and said he was sorry she went through that. Ella thanked him quietly. She wasn't crying, but her voice had the kind of softness that comes from letting old memories rise to the surface. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped, the wind whispered against the shutters, and the room felt heavy with shared understanding. Jake felt closer to Ella in that moment than he had felt to anyone in years. Then Ella picked up a cloth and began to check his bandages again. She told him the swelling had gone down a little, but that he still needed days of rest. Jake smiled faintly and said she had already made that very clear. Ella looked embarrassed, as if she thought she had been too harsh earlier, but Jake assured her she did the right thing. She asked him why he felt so determined to leave. Jake hesitated, then admitted he wasn't used to staying in one place or trusting anyone. He told her he lived most of his life believing he had to carry everything alone, mistakes, grief, guilt, all of it. He said staying too long anywhere made him feel like he was taking more than he deserved. Ella listened carefully, not judging, not interrupting. When he finished, she said softly that healing wasn't something a person could rush. She told him it wasn't a sign of weakness to let someone help. Sometimes, she said, strength was knowing when to stop running. Jake didn't respond for a moment. He looked down at his hands, feeling the truth of her words settle heavily in his chest. He wasn't used to people understanding him. He wasn't used to people wanting him to stay for his own good. He whispered that he didn't know how to trust that kind of kindness anymore. Ella reached out and placed her hand near his, not touching, just close enough for him to feel her presence. She said trust didn't have to happen fast. It could come slowly, one safe moment at a time. Jake looked up at her with a kind of quiet surprise. Ella smiled gently. The day passed with small, steady moments like that. Ella tending to his ribs, Jake opening up piece by piece. They talked about simple things, too. The valley, the weather, Jake's horse, the herbs she grew in her garden. The conversation flowed easily, the kind that only happens when two people are slowly learning to feel comfortable around each other. By evening, the rain had stopped completely. Soft, golden light poured through the window, painting the cabin walls with warmth. Jake felt tired, but peaceful. Ella brought him fresh blankets and made sure he was warm before night settled. Before she stepped away, Jake stopped her with a quiet question. He asked why she didn't push him away like most people did when they found trouble. Ella paused and then told him something that stayed with him long after she walked away. She said helping him wasn't a burden. It was a choice she didn't regret. She said he reminded her that kindness still mattered in a world that took too much from people. And she said she didn't want him to disappear from her life the way others had. Jake lay silently long after she returned to her chair. Those words touched something inside him that had been locked away for years. For the first time, he didn't feel like a traveler passing through. He felt like someone who mattered, if only for a moment. As the night deepened, Jake watched Ella as she sat near the fire, her expression calm and thoughtful. He felt safe, truly safe, in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. And before sleep took him, he quietly made himself a promise. Tomorrow, he would stop trying to leave. Tomorrow, he would let himself heal, with her beside him. The next morning began with soft golden light spreading across the valley. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world washed clean. Drops of rain still hung from the leaves outside, and the cool breeze carried the scent of wet earth. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low but steady, filling the room with gentle warmth. Jake opened his eyes slowly, expecting the familiar ache in his ribs. And yes, the pain was still there, but it was lighter than before. He breathed carefully, testing how much his body could handle. He knew he wasn't fully healed, but he felt stronger, strong enough to sit up without Ella rushing to catch him. He leaned back against the pillows and looked around the cabin. Ella was near the window, opening the shutters to let in the morning light. When she noticed he was awake, she smiled, small, warm, and full of calm energy. Jake greeted her softly, and she replied in the same gentle tone. It felt natural now, this slow beginning to the day, as if they had known each other far longer than just a few days. When Ella walked over to check on him, Jake didn't feel awkward anymore. He didn't feel like a burden. He felt safe. And surprisingly, he felt wanted in a quiet, honest way. Ella checked his bandage carefully, noticing how the swelling had reduced. She told him he was recovering well but still needed more rest. Jake chuckled softly, reminding her that she had made her rules very clear. Ella blushed, but she didn't deny it. After breakfast, which Ella helped him eat little by little, Jake asked if she needed help with any chores. She gave him a firm look and reminded him he was not allowed to lift anything or walk around too much. He raised his hands in surrender, smiling at the way she scolded him gently, like someone who cared more than she wanted to admit. Ella spent the morning tending to her small garden behind the cabin. Through the open window, Jake watched her carefully pull weeds, sort herbs, and check the soil. She moved with purpose and calmness, like the earth itself listened to her. Jake loved watching her work. There was something peaceful in her presence, something healing that went beyond herbs and warm blankets. As the sun climbed higher, Ella brought in fresh herbs to dry. She checked on Jake again, and he sat up a little straighter. He told her he appreciated everything she had done for him. She nodded but didn't say anything right away. Instead, she sat down in the chair beside him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Jake could sense she had something on her mind. After a long pause, Ella asked him what he planned to do once he healed enough to ride. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Jake felt it immediately. He had been thinking about it himself, though he tried to avoid the thought. He cleared his throat and looked down at his hands. He said he didn't have a real destination, that he had been drifting from place to place for years. Ella nodded, waiting for him to say more. He took a deeper breath, carefully so his ribs didn't hurt, and admitted that wandering didn't feel the same anymore. Something inside him had shifted since coming to the cabin. Ella didn't speak, but her eyes softened, showing she was listening. Jake told her he didn't know what he wanted yet. He didn't know if he belonged anywhere. But he also said that the days he spent in her cabin were the first peaceful days he had felt in a long time. He said her kindness made him realize how tired he was, tired of running, tired of pretending he didn't care about anyone, tired of carrying old guilt like a shadow. Ella's eyes grew warmer, but she kept her voice steady. She told him he didn't have to decide anything right away. Healing took time, not just for the body, but for the heart, too. Jake smiled at her words. They made sense. They always did. As the day passed, Jake rested and Ella worked quietly around the cabin. Every so often, they exchanged small smiles or soft conversations about simple things: the weather, the valley, the horses, memories of their childhoods. Their voices blended with the peaceful sounds of nature outside. By late afternoon, Jake felt strong enough to stand with Ella's help. She supported his arm carefully as he walked a few slow steps across the room. The air outside smelled fresh, and sunlight poured across the grass in golden waves. Jake breathed it in like medicine. Ella watched him with a mixture of pride and worry. She told him not to push himself too fast. Jake agreed, though the warm smile on his face made it clear he felt grateful just to stand again. When he sat back down, Ella brought him a small book she kept near the bedside. She said her mother used to read it to her when she was young. Jake accepted it gently, feeling honored. Ella read a few pages aloud, her voice calm and soothing. Jake listened like a tired traveler hearing music for the first time in years. As evening approached, the sky turned orange and pink, and the valley glowed with soft colors. Ella lit the lanterns and prepared dinner. Jake watched her quietly, appreciating every small moment, the way she hummed softly, the way she set the table, the way she looked over at him to make sure he was comfortable. After dinner, Jake asked if he could step outside for a little fresh air, just by the porch. Ella hesitated but agreed, as long as he held onto her arm. Together they stepped out onto the wooden porch. The air was cool and the world felt peaceful. Scout, Jake's loyal horse, stood near the fence, healthy and calm thanks to Ella's care. Jake looked at the valley, then at Ella. He felt something heavy lift from his heart. He told her softly that leaving didn't feel right anymore. Ella looked surprised, then thoughtful, then hopeful, but she didn't speak immediately. She waited for him to say it clearly, not rushing him. Jake told her that the world outside the valley was cold and loud, that he had tried living without anyone for years, that he had convinced himself he didn't deserve a place to rest. But then he looked into her eyes and said that she had shown him something he hadn't felt in a long time. She asked him what that was. Jake took a slow breath and said, "Home." Ella's eyes filled with emotion, not tears, just something deep and soft and warm. She stepped closer, not touching him, but standing near enough for him to feel her presence. She asked him if he was sure. Jake nodded. He said he didn't want to run anymore, not when someone like her was willing to share her quiet world with him. Ella didn't hide her smile this time. It was gentle and full of relief. She told him he didn't have to make promises. She simply asked if he wanted to stay long enough to heal fully, without rushing, without fear. Jake answered that he wanted to stay as long as she would allow. Ella said softly that he could stay as long as his heart needed. Jake felt warmth spread through him, a peace he had not felt since childhood. The valley looked beautiful in the fading light, but the sight of Ella beside him felt even more beautiful. They walked back into the cabin slowly, side by side, comfortable in the silence that followed. Jake settled into the bed again, and Ella placed a fresh blanket over him. She whispered that healing often takes longer than people expect. Jake smiled, closing his eyes. And for the first time in many years, he didn't dream of running, or storms, or guilt. He dreamed of a cabin in a quiet valley, warm light, gentle words, and a woman who had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to stay. And in the soft glow of the lantern, Ella sat beside him, knowing that her quiet life had changed too, not because she saved a stranger, but because that stranger chose to stay.